Imagine for a moment that you are standing in the middle of a dense, dark forest. This forest is your mind. For years, you have been walking down the same muddy path over and over again. The mud is deep, the ruts are established. You try to step out of the path to find a new way, but the grooves are so deep that you just slide right back in. This is what depression feels like for millions of people. It is not just sadness, it is a rigid, inescapable loop of negative thought. Now, imagine two different guides appear to help you out of this forest. The first guide hands you a walking stick. They say, "This stick will help you walk through the mud more easily. It won't make the mud go away, and it won't change the path, but it will numb your feet so the cold doesn't bother you as much. You have to carry this stick every single day, perhaps for the rest of your life." The second guide offers you something completely different. They offer you a map and a flashlight, but there is a catch. They say, "We are going to lift you up above the trees for 6 hours. You will see the entire forest. You will see where the path started and where it ends. You might see scary things. You might see beautiful things. But when you come back down, the mud will be gone, and you will have the freedom to walk in any direction you choose." This is not a fairy tale. This is the exact scientific premise behind one of the most significant clinical trials in the history of modern psychiatry. But in the corridors of Imperial College London, and now around the world, it is known simply as the Psilodep trifoil.
For the first time in history, researchers didn't just test a psychedelic drug against a placebo. They didn't just compare it to a sugar pill. They put it head-to-head against the reigning champion of depression treatment. In the red corner, Escitalopram. You might know it by its brand names. It is a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, or SSRI. It is one of the most effective, widely prescribed, and gold standard antidepressants in the world. In the blue corner, psilocybin, the active psychoactive compound found in magic mushrooms. Not a daily pill, but a high-dose, 2-session psychedelic experience. The question this study asked was dangerous. It was bold. And the answer it found was complicated enough to divide the scientific community, yet promising enough to potentially change how we treat mental illness forever. Today, we are going to walk through this study, line by line. We are going to look at the brain scans. We are going to hear about the music playlists used during the sessions. And we are going to look at the data that suggests we might be on the verge of a paradigm shift, from a model of maintenance to a model of transformation. Welcome to Clinical Trial Explained, and today we deep dive into the science of the Psilodep trial. Before we open the dossier on this specific trial, we have to understand the enemy. We have to understand Major Depressive Disorder, or MDD. When we talk about depression in a clinical setting, we aren't talking about having a bad day. We are talking about a systemic failure of the brain's ability to communicate with itself flexibly. In a healthy brain, neural networks are dynamic. They talk to each other constantly. But in a depressed brain, things become rigid. The brain gets stuck in what we call ruminative loops.
Think of it like a ski slope. If you are the first skier on the mountain, you can go anywhere. But after 1,000 skiers have gone down, deep grooves form in the snow. If you try to ski, you are forced into those grooves. You have no choice. In depression, these grooves are negative thoughts. I am worthless. Nothing will work. I am a burden. For the last 30 years, our best solution has been the SSRI. The drug used in this study, Escitalopram, works by increasing the amount of serotonin available in the gap between your neurons. And it works. For many people, it is a lifesaver. It lifts the heavy fog. But there is a side effect that patients talk about in hushed tones, something that clinical scales often miss. It is called emotional blunting. Patients often say, "I don't feel sad anymore, but I don't feel happy either. I feel flat." It's like turning down the volume knob on the entire stereo system of your life. The screeching feedback of depression gets quieter, but so does the music of joy, connection, and passion. The researchers at Imperial College London, led by some of the most forward-thinking minds in neuroscience, wanted to know, is there a way to fix depression without turning down the volume? Can we actually turn the volume up and still heal the patient? That is where psilocybin enters the story.
Designing a trial for a psychedelic drug is a nightmare for scientists. Why? Because the gold standard of science is the double-blind, randomized controlled trial. This means neither the patient nor the doctor should know who is getting the real drug and who is getting the placebo. If you give someone a sugar pill and you give someone else a high dose of a psychedelic that makes the walls breathe and colors dissolve, it becomes very obvious, very quickly, who is in which group. The blind is broken immediately. So, the designers of this study had to be incredibly clever. They created a 6-week timeline that would keep everyone guessing for as long as possible. They recruited 59 participants. These were not people with mild blues. These were people with moderate to severe major depressive disorder. These were people who had been suffering for years. They split them into 2 groups. Group 1 was the psilocybin group. On 2 specific days, 3 weeks apart, these participants came into the clinic and were given a high dose of psilocybin, 25 milligrams. This is considered a heroic dose in recreational terms. It is enough to induce a full, profound psychedelic experience. But here's the trick. For the rest of the 6 weeks, they had to take a daily capsule at home. To keep them blinded, this daily capsule was a placebo. It did nothing. Group 2 was the Escitalopram group. This group did the opposite. Every single day for 6 weeks, they took a capsule containing Escitalopram, the standard antidepressant. They started at 10 milligrams and ramped up to 20 milligrams, a strong therapeutic dose. But what happened on the 2 dosing days in the clinic? They couldn't just sit there doing nothing while the other group was having visions. So the researchers gave them a tiny, tiny dose of psilocybin, just 1 milligram. 1 milligram is effectively a placebo. It is not enough to cause hallucinations or a psychedelic shift. But it is just enough to maybe make the skin tingle or create a slight physical sensation. It was a decoy, a way to make them think, maybe I am in the psychedelic group. This design is brilliant. It allowed the researchers to compare a 6-week course of daily antidepressants against just 2 active days of psychedelic therapy. Now, I want you to visualize the intervention itself, because one of the biggest misconceptions about this study is that the drug does all the work. Participants didn't just pop a pill and go back to work. They underwent a rigorous preparation process. They met with therapists, guides, who built a relationship of trust with them. They talked about their trauma, their fears, and their hopes. On the dosing day, the room didn't look like a hospital. There were no beeping machines, no sterile white lights. The rooms were decorated with soft fabrics, salt lamps, and comfortable furniture. The participants lay down on a bed. They were given eye shades to block out visual distractions. They were given high-quality headphones. And then there was the music. The music in this trial wasn't just background noise. It was a variable in the scientific equation. The playlist was curated to follow the arc of the drug's effect. In the beginning, during the onset, the music is calm, reassuring, perhaps with some classical strings or ambient tones to settle the anxiety. As the drug peaks, about 2 hours in, the music swells. It becomes more emotional, sometimes even challenging. It drives the listener into their own memories. And as the drug wears off, the descent, the music becomes melodic and gentle, welcoming them back to reality. 2 therapists sat with the participant the entire time, holding their hand if they got scared, reassuring them if they saw something frightening. This container of safety is what allows the patient to dive deep into their own mind without drowning. So, what happened? After 6 weeks, who won? The daily pill or the magic mushroom? This is where the story gets nuanced, and we have to be very precise with our language to respect the science. The primary outcome measure, the main scorecard the researchers decided on before the study started, was a survey called the Quick Inventory of Depressive Symptomatology, self-report. It's a standard questionnaire where patients rate their sleep, their appetite, their sadness, and their energy. The researchers hypothesized that psilocybin would be superior. They expected to see a massive gap between the 2 groups. But when they crunched the numbers at the 6-week mark, the result was a statistical tie. The p-value was 0.17. In science, for something to be considered statistically significant, the p-value usually needs to be under 0.05. Both groups got better, much better. The psilocybin group dropped their depression scores by an average of 8 points. The Escitalopram group dropped their scores by an average of 6 points. While the psilocybin group did improve more numerically, the difference wasn't large enough to rule out random chance. If you only read the abstract of the study, you might walk away thinking, oh, well, mushrooms are no better than regular antidepressants. But you would be missing the real story, because when you look at the secondary outcomes, the data paints a completely different picture. While the primary scorecard was a tie, almost every other measure in the study heavily favored the psychedelic treatment. Let's look at remission rates. Remission means you are no longer considered clinically depressed. In the Escitalopram group, the group taking the daily pill, only 28% of participants achieved remission. That's about 1 in 4. That is pretty standard for antidepressants. In the psilocybin group, 57% achieved remission. That is nearly double. Over half of the people who took the psychedelic therapy were effectively cured of their depressive episode at the 6-week mark. Why wasn't this the headline? Because of the strict rules of clinical trials. Since the primary goal was a tie, the researchers are statistically obligated to be cautious about the secondary goals. But as an observer, the signal is hard to ignore.
Then there is the concept of anhedonia. Anhedonia is the inability to feel pleasure. It's that flatness we talked about earlier. The study used a specific scale to measure this. The participants on Escitalopram showed very little improvement in their ability to feel pleasure. They were less sad, yes, but they weren't necessarily more joyful. The psilocybin group, however, showed massive improvements in their ability to experience pleasure, connection, and meaning. The patients reported something fascinating. Those on the daily pills said things like, "I can function now, but I feel like I'm wrapped in cotton wool." Those on the psilocybin therapy said, "I feel like the fog has lifted. I feel like I can cry again. I feel like I can laugh again." This aligns with a secondary measure called the Warwick-Edinburgh Mental Well-Being Scale. On this scale, the psilocybin group scored significantly higher. They weren't just not depressed, they were actually feeling a sense of well-being. How is this possible? How can 2 doses of a drug change the brain so drastically compared to 42 doses of another drug? The study included detailed fMRI brain imaging, and this is where the science gets incredibly visual. Remember the analogy of the ski slope, the deep grooves of depression? In neuroscience, we call that the default mode network, or DMN. In depressed patients, the DMN is hyperactive and hyperconnected. It is the part of the brain responsible for self-referential thought, basically thinking about yourself, your past, and your problems. In depression, the DMN is like a tyrannical conductor, screaming so loud that no other part of the brain can be heard. Escitalopram works by dampening the stress response. It quiets the noise, but it doesn't necessarily change the conductor. Psilocybin, on the other hand, does something radical. The fMRI scans from this trial and related studies show that under the influence of psilocybin, the default mode network disintegrates. It goes offline. Simultaneously, the communication between other parts of the brain skyrockets. Parts of the visual cortex start talking to the auditory cortex. The memory centers start talking to the emotional centers. The brain becomes entropic, chaotic, fluid, and flexible. Imagine taking a snow globe that has settled and shaking it violently. The snow flies everywhere. The old patterns are disrupted. This is what the researchers call a reset. When the snow settles, after the drug wears off, it settles in a new pattern. The deep ski tracks are filled in with fresh snow. The patient has a chance to ski a new path. This global increase in brain network integration was observed strongly in the psilocybin group. Their brains were literally more connected and flexible after the treatment. The Escitalopram group did not show this change in brain architecture. They just showed a reduction in limbic stress signals. Now, we have to pause. It is very easy to get swept up in the excitement of miracle cures, but responsible science demands we look at the risks. This trial was not all sunshine and rainbows. First, let's talk about adverse events, or side effects. The Escitalopram group reported the classic side effects of SSRIs: nausea, fatigue, and headaches. These are annoying, but usually manageable.
The psilocybin group had side effects too, but they were different. They were mostly acute and transient. That means they happened during the dosing day or the day after. The most common was a headache the next day, likely from the intense neural activity. But during the session, some participants experienced bad trips. They felt anxiety, fear, and confusion. This is why therapists are so crucial. If someone had this reaction alone in their living room, it could be traumatic. In the clinic, the therapists were able to guide them through it, turning a scary moment into a breakthrough. There is also the exclusion criteria. We have to look at who was not allowed in this study. If you had a family history of psychosis or schizophrenia, you were excluded. If you had a history of serious suicide attempts requiring hospitalization, you were excluded. This is vital to understand. Psilocybin is a powerful amplifier of the psyche. For someone with a fragile grip on reality, amplification is dangerous. This treatment is not for everyone, and it certainly isn't something that should be done without screening. Furthermore, we have to talk about the expectation effect. Because psilocybin has been in the news so much, many participants likely came into the study wanting the mushrooms. They had high hopes. When you have high hopes, you tend to report better results. The researchers tried to control for this, but in the world of psychedelics, it is very hard to separate the drug's effect from the hype effect. So, what does this trial actually tell us about the future of medicine?
It tells us that the daily pill model is not the only way. For 50 years, psychiatry has operated on the idea that if you are depressed, you have a chemical imbalance that needs to be topped up every day, like insulin for a diabetic. This trial suggests a different model: episodic intervention. The idea is that you might undergo a high-intensity treatment session, maybe once or twice a year, that resets the system, followed by therapy to integrate the changes. It shifts the patient from being a passive recipient of chemistry, "I take this pill to feel better," to an active participant in their healing. "I went through this experience and learned something new about myself." The data from this study has rippled outward. It has justified larger Phase 3 trials that are happening right now. It has pushed the FDA to grant breakthrough therapy designation to psilocybin. But perhaps the most poignant finding was a qualitative one. In the interviews following the study, the patients on Escitalopram often said, "I can cope better." The patients on psilocybin often said, "I feel like myself again." That distinction between coping and reconnecting is the heart of this entire scientific endeavor.
Now, a very serious word of caution. The results we discussed today come from a highly controlled clinical environment. The participants were screened by medical doctors. The dosing was precise and synthesized, not random mushrooms bought from a dealer. They were supervised by trained mental health professionals who knew exactly what to do if things went wrong. Self-medicating with psychedelics carries significant legal and health risks. This script is for educational purposes only and does not constitute medical advice. If you are struggling with depression, please reach out to a licensed mental health professional or a doctor to discuss the treatments that are currently approved and safe for you. The forest of depression is dark, and for a long time, we only had one type of flashlight to offer. The Psilodep trial has shown us that there might be another way to light the path. It is not a magic bullet. There is no such thing in medicine, but it is a new tool, a tool that doesn't just numb the pain, but might just help us understand the root of it. As we wait for the results of the larger Phase 3 trials, one thing is certain: the field of mental health is waking up. The brain is not just a chemical soup to be stirred. It is a complex, beautiful landscape to be explored. And for the first time in decades, we are drawing new maps. Thank you for watching. If you found this deep dive into the clinical data valuable, consider subscribing for more evidence-based breakdowns of the trials changing our world.